Welcome, everyone. Before we dive into today's reading, I want to take just a quick moment to thank you for tuning in. Independent work like this relies entirely on word of mouth and community support. If this message resonates with you, please consider hitting subscribe and sharing this piece with others who need to hear it. Your support is what makes it possible for these writings to keep coming out. Thank you so much for being here. Let's dive in. Looking past the cloud. Patterns in the infrastructure. As I have sat back, watching the world around us and observing how the narrative is being spun, something has become glaringly obvious. Through careful pattern recognition, observation of the systems around us, and running the actual numbers, I have come to see a stark reality that the mainstream conversation often overlooks. What follows is my own observation and interpretation of those patterns, not a claim that you should accept them without question. I encourage you to look at the information for yourself and draw your own conclusions. Everywhere we look, the mainstream conversation is locked in a petty distraction. We see people blaming everyday consumers for using AI tools, while others point fingers at technology companies, arguing over how much energy a text prompt or a video stream uses. But while everyone is busy fighting with each other over consumer habits, we are missing the forest for the trees. We need to stop fighting amongst ourselves and start asking the real, hard question. What in the heck are these massive data centers truly here to support, if we are willing to accept this level of resource consumption and infrastructure expansion? When you understand the architecture of the system and train yourself to look past the surface noise, patterns begin to emerge. Recognizing those patterns is what forced me to dig deeper, pull the actual numbers, and look past the smoke and mirrors. And when you run the math, something becomes difficult to ignore. The scale of these facilities cannot reasonably be reduced to the activity of individual consumers alone. The consumer guilt narrative keeps our attention focused inward, policing our own digital habits, while the physical infrastructure expands right under our feet. It is time to wake up. Let us look at what these data centers are actually built to sustain, and what the research reveals when we strip away the corporate camouflage. The industrial thirst, consumer habits versus data scale. If you follow the fiber optic cables past the edge of your city to the rural zoning parcels where this infrastructure actually lives, the sterile abstraction of the cloud vanishes. It is replaced by the heavy, thundering apparatus of modern industry. The physical footprint of our digital landscape can be profoundly thirsty. Facilities that rely on evaporative cooling can consume enormous quantities of water, with the exact amount depending on the size of the facility, its computing load, climate, and cooling technology. At the largest scale, that can mean millions of gallons of water per day. To keep tens of thousands of processing units from overheating under continuous computational loads, some hyperscale facilities rely on cooling towers in which water is evaporated to remove heat from the system. That water does not simply disappear from the equation, it becomes part of the physical resource demand required to keep the machines running. When we compare this infrastructure with everyday consumer habits, the contrast becomes difficult to ignore. A single text interaction with an AI model is a relatively brief computational event. It activates computing resources, processes the request, generates a response, and ends. By contrast, the physical facilities being constructed to support the broader digital economy operate continuously, often at enormous scale. The numbers simply do not align with the idea that the environmental burden can be understood primarily through individual lifestyle choices. The real question is not whether consumer activity contributes to demand. Of course it does. The question is whether focusing almost exclusively on the individual consumer allows us to overlook the much larger industrial system being built to support that demand. That is where the numbers become interesting. The scale of the illusion, consumer prompts versus continuous data systems. When we look at the numbers surrounding infrastructure, the illusion of consumer guilt begins to crack. Let us start with the consumer interaction itself. According to Google's published research on the environmental impact of AI inference, a median text prompt consumes approximately 0.24 watt-hours of energy under its stated methodology. That is a remarkably small amount of energy for an individual interaction. For perspective, 0.24 watt-hours is roughly equivalent to operating a 10-watt LED bulb for about a minute and a half. That does not mean AI has no environmental footprint. It does. It means that the environmental impact of one individual text interaction is very different from the physical footprint of the infrastructure required to support millions or billions of interactions, along with cloud computing, storage, enterprise workloads, video processing, and other continuous digital services. Now, consider another type of digital infrastructure. A single high-definition surveillance camera operating at 30 frames per second can generate an enormous quantity of data, depending on resolution, compression, bitrate, and recording configuration. If a continuous video stream were generating between 2 and 10 megabytes of data per second, the resulting volume would be approximately 173 to 864 gigabytes over a 24-hour period. At 30 frames per second, that same camera would generate approximately 2.59 million frames in a single day. Now multiply that infrastructure across thousands of cameras, traffic monitors, automated license plate readers, security systems, and other continuously operating data feeds. The point is not that every one of those systems stores every frame forever. The point is that continuous machine-generated data creates a fundamentally different infrastructure demand from a person sitting down and sending an occasional text prompt. Consumer interactions are burst-based. Many infrastructure systems are continuous. That distinction matters. When we lay these numbers side by side, it becomes reasonable to ask, how can we continue framing the environmental burden of expanding digital infrastructure, primarily as a problem of individual consumer behavior? The math does not support such a simple story. Administrative camouflage and local realities. For years, developers have worked within existing municipal zoning and permitting structures to move large technology projects through local approval processes. In some communities, data centers and related infrastructure have been proposed through classifications or development categories that may not immediately communicate the true scale of what is being built. That matters because a project can look very different on paper than it does when you stand beside the finished facility. A parcel described in administrative language can eventually become hundreds of thousands of square feet of industrial-scale computing infrastructure supported by enormous electrical systems, cooling equipment, generators, transmission infrastructure, and utility connections. And increasingly, communities are beginning to push back. The summer of 2026 has already produced several examples. In Nevada, Nye County approved a county-wide moratorium on new data center applications and subsequently voted to ban data centers in the Pahrump Valley's severely over-appropriated water basin. In Florida, several counties have also moved toward moratoriums or tighter controls on hyperscale data center development amid concerns about water, electricity, land use, and community impacts. These developments are not proof of one single hidden agenda. They are something more important, evidence that communities are beginning to recognize the physical consequences of digital infrastructure and demand a closer look before approving it. The secrecy, playbook, NDAs, and local government. When we examine how some of these massive industrial footprints appear in local communities, another troubling question arises. How much can the public actually know about a project before the decisions affecting their community have already been made? Across the country, there have been documented cases involving confidentiality agreements and non-disclosure arrangements surrounding data center development and related infrastructure. The issue is not that every NDA is automatically evidence of wrongdoing. The issue is transparency. Municipalities are supposed to represent the people who live within them. When major infrastructure projects involve questions about zoning, water allocation, electrical demand, tax incentives, or utility agreements, residents have a legitimate interest in understanding what is being proposed and what obligations their communities may be taking on. When corporate confidentiality is layered onto public decision-making, the public can be left trying to understand a project only after the most consequential negotiations have already taken place. That is where the secrecy becomes important. If these facilities are truly being built in the public interest, then the public should be able to ask basic questions about their water consumption, energy demand, wastewater, tax incentives, environmental impact, and long-term infrastructure requirements. Transparency should not be treated as an obstacle to development. It should be part of responsible development, the chemical reality of the cooling loop. The environmental footprint of a data center is not measured solely by how much water enters the facility. We also need to understand what happens to that water while it is being used. In evaporative cooling systems, water circulates through cooling equipment while heat is removed through evaporation. As water evaporates, dissolved minerals and other non-volatile constituents remain behind in the recirculating water. Over time, those dissolved materials become increasingly concentrated. This is why cooling systems use a concept known as cycles of concentration. As concentration increases, operators must carefully manage the chemistry of the cooling water to prevent scaling, corrosion, and biological growth. Water treatment programs can involve biocides, corrosion inhibitors, scale control chemicals, and other treatments designed to keep the system operating safely and efficiently. Eventually, a portion of the concentrated water must be removed from the system. That process is known as blowdown. The purpose of blowdown is not simply to dump waste. It is a necessary part of controlling the concentration of dissolved materials within the cooling system. But that also means the wastewater leaving a cooling system can contain higher concentrations of dissolved solids and treatment chemicals than the original makeup water. And that raises an important question. What happens to that water after it leaves the facility? That question is not theoretical. For instance, in July 2026, the Ohio EPA chose not to finalize a proposed statewide general wastewater discharge permit for data centers. Instead, the agency continued requiring individual NPDES permits for facilities seeking to discharge wastewater, following significant public feedback and concerns about the environmental oversight of these facilities. That decision matters because it demonstrates something very simple. The wastewater produced by rapidly expanding digital infrastructure is becoming a real regulatory and public concern. The details matter, so does the oversight, rejecting the guilt narrative. When the public conversation addresses the ecological strain associated with digital infrastructure, it often relies heavily on a framework of individual consumer guilt. Mainstream headlines and corporate public relations campaigns can leave people believing that the resource crisis is primarily a consequence of everyday digital habits. Whether that means querying an AI assistant, streaming video, or using personal technology tools. But there is a difference between contributing to demand and being responsible for the infrastructure decisions made to satisfy that demand. That distinction matters. By framing the entire problem as a consequence of consumer behavior, we risk shifting our attention away from the companies, developers, utilities, regulators, and governments making decisions about where massive facilities are built, how they are cooled, how much electricity they require, what water sources they use, and how their wastewater is handled. When we strip away the conversational fluff and look at the physical infrastructure, the picture becomes much larger than an individual person sitting at home and typing a prompt. The concrete monoliths, the utility agreements, the zoning decisions, the water demands, the wastewater questions, and the emergency regulations tell a story of systemic infrastructure. That does not mean individual choices are irrelevant. It means individual choices are only one piece of a much larger system. If we allow the narrative to convince us that our casual productivity tools are the primary source of the crisis, we risk remaining blind to the massive digital infrastructure being permanently anchored into our local utilities. True accountability requires us to look past the distraction of consumer convenience, reject the false assignment of individual responsibility for decisions made at the infrastructure level, and look directly at the machinery being built around us. Conclusion: refusing the cage. When we step back and look at the big picture, the pattern becomes easier to see. As long as we are kept busy pointing fingers at each other, blaming our neighbors, our friends, or everyday consumers for using a digital tool, the larger infrastructure conversation can disappear into the background. Every moment we spend fighting among ourselves over personal AI use is a moment we are not looking at the heavy machinery being anchored into our local utilities. That division may be convenient for those who benefit from keeping the conversation focused on individual behavior, but we do not have to accept that framing. It is time to stop falling for the misdirection. The change starts locally, and it starts with each of us choosing to look past the noise. Talk to your local government boards. Demand transparency on zoning permits, water use agreements, utility commitments, wastewater permits, and confidentiality arrangements. Do the research for yourself. Look at the numbers. Ask what is actually being built in your own backyard, and then ask the questions that matter. How much water will it use? How much electricity will it require? Where will that water come from? Where will the wastewater go? Who approved it? What agreements were signed? And what happens to the community if the infrastructure demand continues to grow? When we stop fighting the wrong battles and focus our energy on understanding the systems being built around us, we take back something that is far more important than an argument. We take back our ability to see. Reflection. Have you noticed the fighting among people over this issue? Have you ever found yourself looking sideways at a neighbor or a friend for using AI tools, while missing the massive industrial infrastructure rising just down the road? Have you taken a moment to ponder the sheer scale of energy and water being consumed by some of these facilities and run the numbers for yourself? And if we stopped getting distracted by arguments over individual behavior and started looking more closely at the infrastructure itself, do you think it would change how we protect our communities? If this perspective resonates with you and you feel the call to look deeper beneath the surface, please take a moment to like, share, subscribe, and follow along for more insights as we continue uncovering and unlocking this journey inward. For those ready to go further, I invite you to explore my book, The Ark of Truth, available now on Amazon, which dives deeper into unlocking these vital pieces within yourself. Sabaoth Jesula.